Okay, this is Chapter 6, Organizational Patterns. This is a relatively long lecture, so hang in there with me. So a reminder that the purpose of an informative speech is to transfer information. It is not to transform the person you're speaking to by convincing them to change in some way. It's simply getting more information in their head than they had before. How do you do that? Repetition is really important. One of the most basic ways of doing that is tell us what you're going to tell us the thing, tell us what you told us. That's in the intro, body, and conclusion. A way to transfer information is actually to connect with the audience. Key way of that is through emotional connections. When audiences feel emotionally connected, they actually retain more information. You're going to just share with your knowledge, and you're going to share your knowledge, share your experiences. Those things help you to connect with the audience. Perceived futures are really critical here. If you can help your audience to see that they're going to need this information down the road, it's going to be more likely they'll hang on to it. Another great way to transfer information besides repeating information and connecting to the audience is using visual aids. That's why we spend a fair amount of time talking about them in this class, and I really push you to use them. Don't have to use them in the first speech. I recommend it. Visual aids are so powerful. Human beings are really visually connected, and when we connect together visual stuff with the auditory at the same time, it makes it stick better. That's your goal, is to have your information be sticky, that it's going to go into people's brains and stick there. Finally, in terms of transferring information, you want to use a coherent pattern. So the example here is showing different kinds of light and light waves and how this works. So general white sunlight is got all these different colors, all these different wavelengths at the same time, and we perceive it then as being just regular light. An LED is monochromatic. It's all one color, but the waves aren't in sequence. It's different from a laser. So I'm using this as an example to think about from going from messy to the most coherent possible. And when we talk about lasers, we talk about it being coherent light. It's a single color. All the light waves are in phase. That's what makes a laser work the way it does. So finding ways to have a coherent pattern of the organization that you're using to transfer that information. So what are we talking about when we're talking about coherent organizational patterns, and what do they do? They help your speaker. They help you, the speaker, to remember where you are and where you're going. They give you confidence. When you have that roadmap, you're going to speak more confidently. The audience will perceive you as being more credible. They're also going to help the audience stay in the room, not to crawl around inside their own heads. Pay attention. They're going to help that information get into their heads and stick and get retained. So, what is this about patterns, and how does the brain work, and why are these important? Random stuff is in fact much harder for us to retain. So let me give you a little sidebar here about how the brain works. This is a picture of a 1971 Honda 350 Twin. How do I know that? I own one in this beautiful candy gold color. So if I'm going to talk with you about something presumably you don't know much about, I could throw a lot of information at you. Even just the name of this thing, 1971 Honda 350 Twin in a candy gold color. When you know things about motorcycles, then you can actually unpack those words, and they mean things already. The 350 is the displacement. It's the size of the engine, for example. Okay, so I throw a bunch of numbers and words at people, and maybe it doesn't make any sense. And then your brain wants you to organize it and start to put into a coherent pattern. What happens is that our brains have really unlimited ability to store information long term. If I were to ask you to think about a bicycle you had when you were a child, you would be able to call up all kinds of things about that bicycle, its color, what it felt like to ride it, maybe video clips of yourself on it as you remember these things. that are all very complicated. Up until I said think about an early bicycle, none of you were thinking about a bicycle. So it's all stored in your unconscious, and then you bring this stuff up into your conscious brain. So our subconscious, our unconscious is really very close to unlimited. Our conscious brain is terribly limited. We actually can only focus on a few things at once. Brain scientists tell us that we can hang on to 5 to 9 chunks of information at once in our conscious brain before we need to just drop it, or we get overwhelmed. So how does this work in actuality? Well, you take something as complicated as this 1971 Honda 350 Twin and you break it into chunks. So if you just were to look at the front end of this motorcycle and looking at that, the front wheel and the components that are there. So rather than looking at the whole motorcycle, we're just focused on the front end here. At the top, you got some shocks, there's a fender, rubber tire, there's the hub, spokes. Inside the central hub, there's a brake system, there's going to be a valve stem for getting air in and out of this thing, right? So there are all these parts that are part of the wheel. And I can take and I can focus in, and I can focus in on the spokes and say, here's the components to the spokes and how a spoke works, right? And then I say, but let's go back and be thinking about the whole motorcycle again. And suddenly all that stuff, all those components just become the front end, just become the front wheel. You're no longer thinking about the spokes. You could by going back in and breaking it out. So this is how we do what I call chunking information. You can go into detail and then you say, and that all is the wheel. And in your brain, all those parts are now part of something that's just called the front wheel or the front end. And you can open it back up again and unfold that information, or leave it folded up so that you can hang on to that information and think about the back wheel in relationship to the front wheel. And suddenly now you're just trying to hang on to kind of 2 things at once, back wheel and front wheel. Because if I'm asking you to think about back wheel, front wheel, fuel system, drivetrain, how to tighten the chain, your brain can't do it. You can only hang on to 5 to 9 chunks of information at once. So that's why we need an organizational pattern that allows our audience to follow us as we open things up and get complicated with them and then collapse them back down in order to move on to other things. So the book talks about there being several basic patterns for organizational patterns that are most common and most user-friendly. So we're just going to look at there, and there are 4 of them. Chronological. Chronos meaning time, so organizing something by time. So here in the graphic next to this, there's a speed statistics for different kinds of trains. And these go from a horse-drawn train all the way to a maglev train. Why is it organized this way? This is not just by speed, this is in fact by time, when these things were developed. And those 2 things are correlated, right? The faster the train goes, the more modern it is. But the point here is that you could talk about different kinds of trains and you could organize it chronologically. Here's a spatial pattern looking at how a volcano works and not thinking about it chronologically as what is the first thing that happens in an eruption and then there's the last thing in an eruption, but looking at it spatially. What is the body of a volcano? What are the parts? And so in this case, spatially you could organize from the cone from the top down. Probably you would want to go from the bottom up because that is also, there's a chronological development there, right? The magma comes up. And so in terms of helping this be spatially coherent for your audience, if you talked about the parts of it from bottom to top, and then you talked about the action of a volcano erupting from bottom to top, those 2 things are working together. If you do it spatially starting at the top going down, and then you talk about the magma coming up, it's harder for the brain to hang on to. So you want to get those organizational sub-patterns synchronized. Causal, cause and effect. Is another basic pattern. This graphic is pretty complicated. There's a lot going on here. You wouldn't want to use this as a PowerPoint visual aid. There's just too much going on. But the point here is that as you're thinking about cause and effect, what is it that's causing global warming and global weirding? The amount of greenhouse gases we're putting out in the atmosphere then has a reaction with solar radiation and has a feedback loop. There's a cause and effect there. We understand that that sort of as its own organizational pattern. So you're going to want to talk about what are the causes and what are the effects. And then in the case of a feedback loop, you would talk about causes, effects, and causes again, as we understand then that it's in a feedback loop and is going to continue to increase. The fourth basic pattern is called topical. Basically what this means is you don't have a pattern. You've just got some things that are all related to your main topic that you're talking about, but you haven't found anything better than just, oh, they're all related to motorcycles, for example. What I would tell you is this, you're really much better off finding something that is more coherent. Topical is not coherent. Topical is by definition incoherent. You can sometimes frame it with an acronym or a mnemonic device to help us, oh, okay, these are the parts that we're following, but you're just better off really diving back in and trying to find another pattern to help us understand your topic. Okay, so part of what you want to be doing with your organizational pattern is providing a map of the route. Where are you going, and how does this work? This is an image of a climber on the south buttress of Mount Moran. This is not me, although I have done this climb, and that's Jackson Lake in the background and Jackson Hole. This is the Tetons. So in this very complicated climb, you get a map of the route. So this is what the route looks like. If you're looking up at the south buttress of Mount Moran and attempting to climb this thing, that's what you see is this really incredible granite. And at the top right-hand side you can see the flat dish there of the rock, and that's where the route goes. It is incredibly terrifying. If you're a rock climber and you were doing this, this is what a map of the route looks like. These are it basically tells you what to look for, where the cracks go, what directions things happen in, distances, and all that stuff. It's a map of the route. It's not the route itself. Okay, so how do you provide this map of the route so that your audience members know where you're going and can follow along? Got to start with an effective introduction. So in that introduction, you want to grab her. You want the very first thing that's going to grab our attention. Sometimes you need to justify the topic or the thesis. Why are we listening to a speech about the brown-headed cowbird? Right? If it's not immediately obvious, you need to justify it. If it does have sort of that base level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you don't need to spend a lot of time justifying it. If it's about any of those, sort of anything that's obvious. And of course, how do you know when it's obvious? I don't know. You know it. Ask somebody else. Then you want to provide an outline. Where are we going in this intro? Right? That's where we're talking about outlining. It belongs in the introduction. So thinking about in the map of the route, what are the transitions between points in the body? Sometimes there are internal summaries. If you think back to me just talking about the wheel on a motorcycle, right? I can talk about all the parts, and then here's the summary. It's really about the hub, the tire, and the spokes, right? That getting that back in people's heads. Signposting is useful as if you were saying, okay, so we're going to cover these 3 elements, and you finish the first one, and what you can say then is, we've just finished the first one, and we're about to start on the second one. That reminds audiences of where the overall route is, but also gives them a sense of where they are in the route. The metaphor here is driving down the road, right? If you were driving from Moorhead to the Twin Cities, you might say, okay, well, we're going to go through Alexandria and we're going to go through St. Cloud before we get to the Twin Cities. And so then it's those literal signposts along the route that help you track where you are in the overall pattern. You want to plan an effective conclusion as well, which is going to have a review. In the same way that you do a preview up in that intro, an outline of where you're going, you're going to review. Okay, this is where we went. Here's the review. Sometimes you need to justify why you spent the time on the topic, but generally not. And then you want a button. It's the opposite end of the grabber, right? It's the thing that finishes things up. The functional definition of a button is it's the cue for the audience to applaud. It tells the audience that the speech is over, well done, and it's time to applaud. So I always know if you've done a button, if everybody knows it's time to clap. The clunkiest button is thank you, I'm done. Oh, okay, there's far clunkier than that. But that's kind of a clunky button, right? As you finish it and thank you. Then it certainly cues the audience to know you're done. But what if you don't actually say that? What if there's something else that you finish and the audience knows it's done? That's when it's really sharp and deftly done. So 4 elements that belong in an introduction, and one of them is kind of iffy, so hang in here with me. So first of all, as I said, an intention getter, a grabber. You got lots of options there. There needs to be something that helps to motivate the audience to listen. And so just think about their inner, mall rats, those high school sophomores who just don't care. I don't care about any of that. Why should I care? So you need to motivate us to listen. You need to help us understand if it's not immediately obvious. There's a level at which you need to be establishing credibility and rapport. That the clunky way of doing that is to say, I've been researching this topic for 3 weeks, and that's how you're trying to establish your credibility. The problem is that in fact is counterproductive. If you've only been researching for 3 weeks, you don't have any credibility. The way you establish your credibility is really your poise, your energy, the confidence that you're bringing in is going to establish your credibility and your connection with the audience. So it's not so much something you say, it's how you are presenting yourself. It's what's going to establish your credibility and rapport with the audience. And like I said, previewing the organizational structure of the speech needs to be here in that introduction. Tell us where you're going. So in terms of making that organization apparent, some stuff we want to hide. I want you to hide your yoga breath so that we don't know you're calming yourself down. But other stuff you need to make very apparent. And the organization should not be a mystery. We should know exactly what your organizational structure is. So repetition, reinstatement, telling us again and again what you're doing and how it's working. Transitions are really critical in terms of helping us understand the organization. When we're looking at it on the page, we can see a paragraph mark. But when we're listening to you speaking, sometimes we can't tell when you've shifted if you're not cueing us by what you say. So signposts and internal summaries, as I said. It really helps to limit your number of main points. 3 to 5 main points is really magic number. And this goes back to our limited conscious brains. If you've got 12 main points, nobody can hold them in their head at once. But if you've got 3 main points, we can hang on to all 3 in our preciously weak little brains. We can hang on to all 3 of those, where you're going next, and the fact that, I don't know, our left temple is itching and we need to scratch it, and the person sitting over there is wearing perfume or cologne that's just too strong, and whatever it is. There's going to be clutter that's going to come into your conscious brain, so you have to keep your main points, the things you want your audience to focus on, simple. Keep it from 3 to 5. Keeping your main points parallel is also really useful, so that if you're talking about this, the steam engine, different kinds of trains, right? I've got the horse-drawn train, I've got the steam engine, I've got the diesel engine. Even just using words like engine and engine is going to be helpful in terms of us tracking this. So the language you're using, the more parallel you can keep that language. One of the key examples out there you should all know is Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, right? I have a dream, I have a dream. And the dreams that Martin Luther King was talking about are different, but he's framing them all with that same language. Look for ways that you can help us. The language you're using is parallel from point to point. Okay, so I have taught this class a lot in the last 20 years, and so I have seen students making mistakes. So there's some really useful things I'm going to be talking about now, about what are organizational blunders that I see and how you can avoid those. So the first one is students who use a definition of the thing, or what is the thing, as a main point. Here's a way you might see it. I'm going to do a speech on sleep apnea. My first main point is a definition. I will talk about symptoms, causes, and treatments. How do you fix this? This should be your organizational pattern. You're talking about sleep apnea. You're going to talk about the symptoms, the causes, and the treatments. Where does the definition go? Definition goes into your introduction. It's not a main point. Hypothermia. What is hypothermia as the main point? The process of hypothermia and treatment for the hypothermia. Okay, here's a better organizational pattern. Hypothermia, getting it, treatment, recovery. It's a chronological approach to this concept, to the information you might want to share with people about hypothermia. Do you define hypothermia? Sure, do that in your introduction. Definitions belong in the intro, or maybe not needed. I'll remind you of the student who defined prostitution in each of his speeches for us. We never needed prostitution defined. All adults know what prostitution is. Okay. Facts as main point is organizational blunder number 2. Sleep apnea, symptoms, causes, treatment, and some facts about sleep apnea. Or God help us, fun facts. Where do facts belong? Well, they belong in each of the areas. You're providing facts about the symptoms, facts about the causes, facts about the treatments. If you have extra facts that don't fit in here, then something is wrong with your organizational pattern. Evidence should be in all the body sections. Evidence doesn't belong in its own section. All right, topical patterns is the most frequent organizational blunder number 3. As I said before, topical patterns, I think, are just kind of lazy. So if I wanted to talk about hybrid motorcycles, here would be a topical speech. How hybrid motorcycles work, the history of the development, a personal story I have about a hybrid motorcycle, and maybe look at new discoveries that are on the horizon about hybrid motorcycles. How would I take and fix this? Maybe make it spatial. I'm going to talk about hybrid motorcycles. I'm going to talk about the parts of the motorcycle, right? The batteries, the engines, the transmissions. That's the important part that makes a hybrid motorcycle different from an internal combustion, gasoline-powered motorcycle. So just really focusing on the drivetrain. But I could do it spatially. I could show it on the motorcycle, and we would go probably from the front of the bike to the back of the bike. I could maybe do a chronological approach. Thinking about hybrid motorcycles, what were the origins? How did they develop? And where are we at the most innovations now? Right? So starting early and coming through time to now. So almost always, in my experience, topical patterns can be reframed into something more coherent for the audience. Okay, preparing to speak. So you've gotten your speech topic, you've done some research, and organizing. So some things that are in this chapter talking about preparing to speech. So you're going to prepare your visual aids. As a reminder, they're not required for this first speech, but I recommend them. I think they are useful to you and the audience. You're going to rehearse, including dress rehearsal. So this is a term from the theater. In most of our rehearsals in the theater, everybody just shows up in whatever clothes they're wearing, and you do your rehearsals and you kind of work out where things are. At dress rehearsals, we add in clothing, lighting, scenic elements, props, all the things that are going to be there on the day. So when you are rehearsing, you're going to start rehearsing probably just kind of rough. Maybe you'll do some rehearsals as you're, taking your shower or something. I don't know. You're thinking about it in your head. You must rehearse out loud. I would recommend you come into the space to rehearse. The classrooms are open for you to use. Come on in, stand there, get things set up, understand how it's going to feel to stand there, the chairs, where are they, how big is the room, how does the room feel, all that stuff. It's going to help you on the day if you have rehearsed. If you're doing a demonstration speech where you have things that you're showing, you must have all those props ready at your rehearsals so that when you actually come time to do the speech and demonstrate, you really know what you're doing. You're going to want to make speaking notes. We will take some time in class to work on this, where you're going to go from your extensive written notes to outlining to speaking notes. You can see a sample on page 242. My suggestion is you make your speaking notes as sparse as possible. One of the biggest blunders that I see from students is not doing extemporaneous speaking where they are reading the speech. Anybody can read a speech. You are all college students. I know you can read out loud. Can you speak from 5 words? 7 words? How few of words could you use? That's your goal, is to get to the fewest words possible. So please don't speak from a full sentence outline or a manuscript. That is just reading. You're going to want to use short phrases. If you do some full sentence quotes, that's great. You sometimes need to write those out word for word because you're quoting somebody and you want to make sure you get those words right. That's fine. You can read those things at us, but you want to keep them short. And so anytime you're quoting somebody, if you can, look at it and go, well, do I need this whole paragraph? Or can I just quote the 5 words that are really the critical ones and I can paraphrase the rest of the concepts? That's your goal. Keep those full sentence quotes short. Your speaking notes are going to want to have delivery notes, transition cues, and oral citations. So delivery notes like slow down, enunciate. Transition cues are things like reminding yourself that here's a transition and you need to take that breath. Oftentimes we do this, right? Is like you're kind of cranking along, and just by taking and letting 2 or 3 seconds of silence be there tells us you're moving on to the next thing. Oral citations are where you give us, where did you get this information from? According to an article in Time magazine from this last month, blah, 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 blah. So those notes of your oral citations need to be in your speaking notes in order for you to make sure that you are connecting those and giving us that information. And you're going to want to use an outline form for your speaking notes. So, or as you're creating them. So this is outline form. It's in your book like this, but rather than being written out as paragraphs, it is literally, Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, main point is under A. Those kinds of things are really what you should be doing. And form matters. And sometimes it doesn't matter. In this case, it really does. It'll help you to see the speech in a different way. And we will work on this in class as well. Use this form, please.